How have the West Midlands managed that transition between where you might have quite technical colleagues, climate emergency specialists, etc., but how do they make it real for economic development, intergenerational services, infrastructure, transport planning? How do we start to make it real around sustainability becoming embedded? So that was really the context. So, Claire, if I can hand over to you.
You certainly can. So I'm just going to share my screen and hope that nothing melts, which it really ought not to, but you never can tell. So I'm hoping you can see that now. Wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me. I like to think that we are all kind of fellow travellers in trying to do economics in this way. So I find it genuinely helpful to learn from other places. And so I hope it's going to be equally helpful for you. So as Jenny says, I work at the West Midlands Combined Authority. My role is as a senior programme lead for inclusive growth. And that's a role I've been doing since 2018. And I guess where I would start from is that the way that we've used the donut in the West Midlands Combined Authority is as a way to frame all of our policy and our activity on inclusive growth. But as I know I'm talking to a substantively London and Greater London audience, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the West Midlands Combined Authority so that you know where we're talking about. So we are one of 10 mayoral combined authorities in England. We are comprised of 7 constituent authorities. So you can see all of those that are labelled in that image of the map there. Those are the 7 constituent authorities, and they all get to elect the mayor. Surrounding it in the other orangey bit of the map, you can see the 12 non-constituent authorities. And together we form what is termed in a very cuddly way as a functional economic geography, which is to say that substantively people both live and work in that boundary. So when you're talking about economic governance and economic leadership and economic policy, it really makes sense to consider it at that sort of spatial level. So our combined authority is led by an elected mayor, Andy Street, and he has been our mayor since it has been possible for us to have a mayor. So that was in 2017. And he's now just over 6 months into his 2nd term of office, and he is a Conservative mayor. His cabinet, his selection of portfolio holders, are comprised of leaders from across those 7 metropolitan authorities, as well as a couple from the outsides. And what you notice is that there is a really even split between Conservative leaders and Labour leaders. So actually, even though we already have cross-geography collaboration baked into how the combined authority works, you also have cross-party collaboration baked into how it works. So the mayor could not pass his budget if the Labour leaders did not back it. So that obviously has implications for how we do this work. So I'm hoping that will kind of become clear as I talk things through. So let's start with inclusive growth. And it's probably also quite clear that I had just read Doughnut Economics at the time that we started to bring this together. So before I started, the combined authority had already agreed that inclusive growth was what it wanted to do. It just didn't really know what it was. It just knew that it liked inclusive growth, because it's really hard to disagree with that as a phrase, because they are both quite nice words on the whole. But the way that we pursued it, and I think this was really sensible, was to work really closely with civil society, with those intermediary organisations that feel the most what happens when the economy doesn't work for people. So it was really important to us that this definition meant something, because if inclusive growth didn't mean anything, then it's not going to happen. And I think that if you look at all of the different dimensions of this definition, you can see where Doughnut Economics has had an influence. So firstly, it talks about judging the economy by the social and environmental outcomes it creates. So being really clear what our expectations are of the economy. Secondly, it cares about who gets to create growth. And thirdly, it cares about who gets to benefit from growth. And all of those elements are relevant and pertinent to Doughnut Economics. So this is a definition that we felt very confident really summed up what we were trying to achieve. And don't worry, there are not too many tedious animations. So this is where we started with so having done the definition, it was like, all right, well, that's the definition. So let's now move on to what good looks like. And it was really clear that the donut model had a lot to offer here. So what we were trying to do was to say, all right, well, if growth, jobs and trade aren't telling us enough about what an economy should look like, about what it should be achieving, let's think about what should be in there. And so that donut on the left is very much the, what should be in there. So one thing, this is a personal bugbear of mine, but I'm sure we've all done it at one point or another, is talk about the crane test. So it's like, oh, the economy's going wonderfully, isn't it? Because land's really expensive and we have to build really high buildings, And yes, the crane test is a good sign that good stuff is going on in an economy. But what about the children living in temporary accommodation test? What about the biodiversity net gain test? What about the affordable childcare test? Because if you are watching the number of children living in temporary accommodation, so the number of homeless children increasing while your economy grows, which is a position we have found ourselves in the WMCA, how can we possibly say that the economy is doing all the things that it should do? It absolutely manifestly is not. So this is what the framework is about. It's about saying, all right, well, if that's not enough about what good looks like, let's articulate that in more detail and using things that enjoy the greatest political salience, both cross-party and in general, because that is pretty important as well. And this slide just makes it a little bit easier to kind of delve into the different sections of our donut model. So we refer to these as fundamentals within the West Midlands Combined Authority. And you can see on the second row that for every fundamental of inclusive growth, we have a headline outcome. So the thing that we think is the most politically salient. So obviously, reducing CO2 is pretty unarguably the most salient point around climate resilience. We think designing out homelessness is the same for affordable and safe places, and so on and so forth. And just showing you the wonderful mess that sits under the hood of that. Because what we've tried to do here, and this is a really hard thing to do, and any of you who've worked in a local authority will recognise this, is that we are trying to get a grip on the number of metrics that we put underneath those outcomes and those fundamentals. Because I think this is not meant to be a wide, far-reaching performance dashboard. This is meant to show balance and priority and vision. And therefore, we're trying to pick bellwether metrics that tell you more about the world around you than the metric themselves. We are not trying to be all things to all people. But of course, when you speak to your colleagues, obviously their work is the most important work in the world, right? So it's really sometimes quite hard to say, I'm not including it because it's not important. It's because we're fundamentally, the clarity is going to be key to how this works. So you can see that you've got the one headline metric for each outcome. You have 4 backing metrics in order to build out that context a little bit. So anyone who works in climate change policy will know, for example, that reducing CO2 is not the only game in town. So we obviously have to reflect the multiplicity of priorities that sit within there. So one thing that's not shown here, but is also important, is that one thing we're commissioning this year coming is a piece of community-led research that we should repeat every 3 years to try and provide the community voice counterbalance to this, because data is fundamentally a flattening of reality. And we feel that we need to speak to those people who we most know are excluded from economic value to check that what we're saying in our data is actually reflecting the experience of those people. So hopefully that kind of makes the inclusive growth framework even more inclusive. And before I move on to some examples of how we've translated this into our practice, I guess one thing that Jenny wanted me to touch on a little bit is, how hard was it to make this a thing at the West Midlands Combined Authority? Like, what did it mean to bring that to the board? And I think we were somewhat fortunate in a number of ways. So partly, I described how we built the definition. We were really manifestly trying to do this in the right way. We were trying to be collaborative. We were trying to be discursive. And I do think that was appreciated by the sorts of people we needed to bring on board. I think it also helped that we were in the earliest stages of being an organisation. So those big questions about what you are and what you're for are absolutely live in a way that they're not when you're a much older organisation. Inclusive growth was also very much the flavour of the month there. It's still in my job title, but I'm not entirely sure that is the same right now. But I will say one thing that I think would be easier now is the inclusion of the environment. Like, people legitimately said I was stupid for putting the environment in the framework the first time around, and I feel really quite vindicated by the fact that I was incredibly stubborn and refused to take it out. So I think we have moved on because the public kind of desire for something to be done on climate change, as manifested through the climate strikers and everything else, has moved this along so much. But finally, I want to say that this bit is actually the easy bit. It's easy to say that you want inclusive growth. And when Kate Raworth has made this beautiful model that makes this kind of balance so clear and manifest, it's not so hard to create yourself a donut. The really hard thing is changing how you work. And I thought I would just describe a handful of those changes just to get the discussion started off. Let's move that along. So let's start first with how we rewire decision making. So you are not intended to read this whole diagram, as one horrified viewer of this commented when I practiced it before. This is just to say, wherever there is a blue blob in that process, you can see that there is an opportunity to consider the donut model and inclusive growth within our process of assurance. So we had a really good opportunity, as the single assurance framework was tightened and remodeled, to redo a lot of the templates and processes around how a business case turns into a thing that the combined authority funds through its investment funds. And that was really helpful. Again, sometimes you are the beneficiary of timing of these things being done anyway. But there were a few important things that preceded that, and this is kind of coming back to the fellow travellers piece. So firstly, we work very closely with Metro Dynamics, who have created an inclusive growth decision making toolkit. So that exists online, both our version and the open source version, which is there to be looked at. But because we'd worked closely with them to create a version of that for the combined authority, we had something that was already really well prepared to be translated into the assurance process. And it really helped that we worked with both GRF and Metro Dynamics and others who had a lot of experience of working within other local and combined authorities to make this a reality. Now, the other thing that I really want to draw out here is that a process is only as good as the humans that run the process, because one of the things that's really interesting about our approach to inclusive growth and how we've gone about it is that nobody has to do this. Like, nobody is mandated to. There are things we are asking people to go above and beyond. We're asking them to do more work. We're asking them to reach out to a wider multiplicity of partners than they otherwise might want to. And so you've got to be kind to those people. I can't just sit there going, if you don't get this right, you're obsolete, get used to it. That is not, you don't make any friends that way. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that, but you don't. And so what you do need to do is think about, all right, well, I work in the sort of policy area of the world. I'm going to be really thoughtful about what my colleagues need in different parts of the world in order to let them play their part in this process. So we've created this inclusive growth business partners network, which is a sort of inversion of normal business partnering. So I have a team of literally 2 people, including me. So I don't have the capacity to business partner extensively. But what I can do is draw on people from different parts of the organisation. So finance business partners, like our solicitors, our comms officers, bring them together in one network where we think about improving their inclusive growth literacy and using that donut frame to take them all the way around the donut so that they understand, for the different things that the combined authority and its partners do, how that might figure in their work and give them the confidence to step into that role. So we're around 9 months into operating that network now. I think it is genuinely one of the most important things we do, and would be very happy to kind of reflect more on that if that is helpful. I'm going to show you another bit of the wiring side of things. So this kind of pertains to the very beginning of a project being a thing. So we tend to do, using the Doughnut again, what we call an Art of the Possible report, which is not going to win any prizes for original titling, but no one gives you prizes for that in local government. So what we try to do is essentially take the idea. So if the idea is we are developing this portion of Chelmsley Wood Town Centre, including the job centre, we work our way around the Doughnut just to say, all right, well, let's imagine that this is the perfect piece of Doughnut-driven partnership. Let's imagine that every link and every thing that you want to happen as a consequence of this happens. What are the sorts of things you could do around this? What areas of public service could you reach out to? How could the community be involved in shaping this, etc., etc.? And we put all of that into a report, not to say you're rubbish if you don't achieve all of this, because that's not realistic. But actually what it does do is give people a sense of, oh, actually, there's probably a real opportunity for remodeling this bit of children's services provision here, but I haven't involved anyone in children's services, and I don't even know if that's a thing at the moment. So I better reach out now before this becomes too developed and gets too far down the way. So we've done about 4 of these so far, and I do think they're helpful. And for colleagues in public health who might be in the room, actually things like the Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, Health Needs Assessment, a really helpful feed to this, because it takes a similar kind of wider determinants approach to working out kind of needs and opportunities. So the next bundle of example is how we strategize. And I'm going to pick WM 2041 for this, which partly draws on the presentation that Jenny saw me and my colleague do. So this was the very first WMCA strategy that really just adopted inclusive growth and the Doughnut wholesale into what it was trying to do. So the only thing we had to start with was a science-based target, which is based on the national carbon budget. But as you'll all know, you could meet a carbon budget in a profoundly unjust way that makes people's lives far, far worse than they are now. And we want more than that for our region, and you all want more than that for your places. So we kind of knew that the carbon budget couldn't be the only game in town there. So we used our inclusive growth framework. We used the Doughnut model, which in itself derives from the Sustainable Development Goals, to outline those 5 outcomes you can see there. So changing our economy without leaving anyone behind, investing into the resilience of places, decoupling prosperity from the consumption of energy, etc., etc. And all that means is that actually you're judging the quality of your investment by a far broader set of standards, just as the Doughnut invites you to do. Like, you don't forget about the people just because you've got an environmental crisis to address. And actually, in the boldest terms, it's like, well, this is investment, and if we're saying from all our other investments they've got to have all these inclusive growth implications, and of course this does as well. And one thing that has spun out of this, so the strategy went through, that was all wonderful, and this first 5-year plan came through this. So I saw a colleague in the room was from WSP, and we can thank WSP for this piece of analysis as they worked with us to create the first 5-year plan. Because one thing we really wanted to look at is not just how many jobs can we create in that first 5 years, but for each of these kind of shifts in the economy, what's it going to look like by 2041? Because what does that imply we need to be doing in the here and now to prepare ourselves for it? And for the West Midlands, this probably isn't much of a surprise, but we've got the same energy efficiency and renewable heat needs that anywhere else does. So obviously you can see that quite a lot of new jobs should spill out of that. But we've also got a substantive manufacturing base in the car industry. And there you can see that electric vehicles, they're expecting to create lots of jobs there too. Where it becomes challenging, and where obviously the donut analysis really helps, is that actually for us to realise those jobs in a way that is inclusive and is well planned and isn't just a kind of load of hiccups of people losing jobs and getting jobs and having their lives turned upside down, is that a whole skill system has to come together. And we also probably need government to pull their finger out a bit when it comes to how retrofit and energy efficiency and heat efficiency works, because like everywhere else in local government, the sort of stop-start nature of how funding and regulation is working in that space is making it really hard to create the sort of job pipeline that would enable us to create some of that job creation. So it's useful to know this, and it's useful that the donut has sent us on this trajectory, but obviously it does kind of start to then spill out what the size of the challenge is. And as you can see there, 140,000 jobs needing to reskill as the result of transition. And some of those will be easier than others. So if you install boilers, it's not a big jump to installing heat pumps. It's a very overlapping and complementary skill set. For others, it won't be that easy a jump. And we have to be very thoughtful about that as that develops. And finally, just on how we collaborate, and hopefully I've given you a reasonable amount of this, but I'll give you a little bit more. So finally, this is how we approached our social economy growth work. So this kind of sprung out at the same time as the general inclusive growth programme did. And the mayor set up his own social economy task force, which was sector-led and independent, basically to say, the combined authority is new. It's not really a place, like no one normal lives in the West Midlands Combined Authority. I live in Kings Heath, I live in Birmingham, but I don't live in the WMCA because it's not a thing. But we've clearly got a role to play because this is an economic thing. So you tell us, what do you expect from the Combined Authority if you're going to play your part in delivering inclusive growth? And they did their work for 2 years, and they came back and said, if we're as good as you say we are, and we already put social and environmental at the heart of everything we do, stands to reason that you just need loads more. So you need to commit to a growth target for the social economy. So that seemed a pretty reasonable toss to argue. So we very much accepted that. And we moved on from that ask. And the first thing they said was, you need to come up with a plan that shows how you're going to achieve that growth. So we commissioned a group of, social enterprises, infrastructure organisations to think about what that plan should cover, which gave us these 10 ecosystem factors that you can see there. But where we ended up was quite interesting, because what they said to us was, there are places that are way ahead of you, there are places that aren't, but the places that seem to do the best are not the places that write, here's a lovely plan of everything, because lovely plans of everything are quite hard to track and hold to account. And we think that you need to do a small handful of things we can hold you to account for. So this document, Growing the Social Economy in the WMCA Area, gives those 4 things that we are now being terrifyingly held accountable for. So you can see those all listed there. But again, trying to bring through that, if one of those themes of inclusive growth is power, influence and participation, if we're really keen on growing this inclusive economy, this can't just be the Claire Spencer show. So it's got to be, we involve the sector in kind of describing this. So what we've done, and what I'm starting to do, is create a virtual team that spans organisations across the region. So crosses local authorities, crosses universities, crosses social enterprise support organisations. So if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, which at the moment in working from homeland is reasonably unlikely, but you never know. But if that happens, this does not live and die on someone's job in the combined authority being this. It's a piece of work that becomes more broadly owned, which I think is really important. And finally, this is how we've been doing some of the, so we've got the framework, we've got a whole load of other things that put the framework into practice. We try to work with our local authority partners to see, all right, well, how does that manifest in your different types of work? And so we're very clear, very respectful of local leadership. We do not seek to impose the combined authority's will on any of our local authority partners, but we want to make the best use of these inclusive growth and donut tools. And the one example I'll pull out from there is Solihull. So we've worked really closely with Solihull on the redevelopment of Kingshurst, which is a small town that's located north of Birmingham Airport. And what we did with them is that we built their own donut. So instead of making one that's region wide, we focused it in on Kingshurst, the place. We basically put into it all of the goals that they'd laid out for themselves, drawn from the community, drawn from other places, just to say, like, this is what your donut looks like. So from what you've told me about what you want to achieve, this is Kingshurst donut. And then we used that as a lens to apply to the plans they'd already started to form. And the greatest success of it was that they were in a point where they'd proposed 40% affordable housing. They used the lens of their own donut that we helped them to build, and now it's 100%, because it was really hard to argue that what they knew about the people who both lived in Kingshurst now and who wanted to live in Kingshurst, that anything other than affordable would do. And I think up to 80% of that will be for social rent. And I won't say that I was surprised that it worked that way, but there was a bit of like, oh, okay, that's good. That's what I hoped would happen. But that was really important. Like, if I had just said, I don't think you're right to do it that way, that would not have worked, right? Because what would it matter that me, who doesn't live in Solihull and doesn't work in Solihull, what would it matter that I thought that? But because it came from the place, it came from them, and the donut helped to elucidate that. That is what helped it to work. So I was really happy with that. So yes, there we go. Sorry, you can't resist using real lovely donuts in there, but I will drop my screen now so that we can have a proper chat.
Claire, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear, and I heard, like you said, I heard some of it at your previous talk, and I was particularly then taken with the amount of planning that you've already started around jobs, training, skills, you know, and the fact that you are part of our country that has a really heavy manufacturing industry, and you've got going quite quickly on that. And I think, you know, whichever region we come from, planning now for the jobs pipeline, as you called it, is really important. Anyway, there are lots of things that came out of your talk. I've got a question from Jonathan, and it relates around the local authorities within the West Mids region. Am I right in thinking, is it 7 local authority areas that you've got?
Yeah, so in the core constituent authorities of the West Midlands, it's 7, but there's a further 12 in the wider non-constituent area, which is a quirk of how CAs work.
Okay. If we just think about the 7, I guess, for a moment, how does the cascading of the donut work, kind of both from the regional authority down to the local authorities, and then from the local authorities perhaps back up to you? Yeah,
so it's interesting. So what I would say is that there hasn't been a lot of really kind of like, oh, how can we make our own donut at X level? Like, some are absolutely taking that route. So for example, Solihull, having done it for Kingshurst, has now tried to frame its kind of borough-wide like perspectives in that way. But it hasn't been an automatic, the CA has done this and now therefore you must have to. And I think I kind of lightly touched on that in the, this was the easy bit to do, because I don't necessarily think it felt like this is a complete upending of the apple cart. It felt like a pretty cozy and sensible way to articulate something that up to that point hadn't been articulated in any specific way. So the way that we've chosen to try and draw the donut in is through that very last example I gave you. It's not through a, well, what does this now look like for Birmingham, or what does this now look like for Wolverhampton? This is more about, let's take something that you're already doing and be helpful as a team. And as I say, we're such a small team that sometimes it makes me weep with the absurdity of it all. But, you know, all we can do is a small team. So you will know we don't have massive budgets. So all we've got is these tools and ourselves that basically says, well, let's go with the grain of something you're already doing. So take Birmingham. Birmingham has created an inclusive growth strategy for the east of Birmingham, and it's formed a special inclusive growth East Birmingham board to kind of lead that work. So it absolutely makes sense for us to take the tools that we've done at the CA, but not to impose those on East Birmingham, but just to go with the grain of what they're doing. So help them build collaborative governance, help them do a donut baseline for their bit of the world, which we did for East Birmingham. So it's looking for the opportunities that align with what local leadership is doing, without doing the imposition. And this kind of comes back to the, I keep emphasizing the collaboration, but the CA only exists because local authorities wish it to. And if they stopped wishing it to, then it wouldn't. So, we always have to be in the add additional value, do not annoy people, always make sure you respect local leadership. And it helps that I'm not faking it. I really do respect all those things, so that makes it quite easy. But yeah, I hope that partly answers it. So the answer is not in the same way at the same time, but we go with the grain of the way that each local authority is leading on that sort of thing.
Okay, and this is a sort of follow-up and slightly attached to what you've just said, really. Have you got an established protocol when you're working with the local authorities, thinking about, I guess, the inclusive growth, economic development, etc., but also any other issues, whether it's public health and economic growth and how that overlaps? Have you got a protocol in place?
Not that I would describe it as. So basically at the point at which, so I mentioned the decision-making toolkit, which was another thing that went to board ahead of it being embedded into the single assurance framework. What the local authorities agreed to at that point was that they liked the idea of the decision-making toolkit and they wanted it to be tested out, and they gave us permission to test it in 2 different areas, and the 2 areas were East Birmingham and North Solihull. So that was what we agreed to do at that time. Subsequent to that, people have said, yeah, crack on, we'd actually quite like you to do more stuff, because obviously then councillors come forward and say, you're not doing anything in Dudley, why not? So we don't have an established way of doing it. So there's no kind of and actually the reality is we're not always brought in at the very beginning of a project. So when we came to Kingshurst, for example, that was already at outline business case phase. So it had already been through a huge amount of development before we even were brought in at all. So we just tend to be, and this is, I guess, one of the advantages of being a combined authority, is that we are not bound in the same way. So we're not a planning authority. I don't have any powers and, as I keep saying, or resources, but what we do have is, I guess, innovative headroom. So if people are trying to solve a problem and you've just got a bit of capacity, you can kind of come in and go, oh, well, if what you need is someone to design a collaborative governance structure, then that's what we'll do. If you need someone who's going to make you a donut model based on your own health needs assessment, then we'll do that. So we're basically being quite protean, if I can use that word, trying to reshape by what a place needs, but we don't have a sort of set agreement of you will deliver this level of service to this number of places. Because it just hasn't worked like that, and that's not what local authorities are asking for. And I will say, in a time when all of our local authorities are budget constrained, to put it kindly, the idea of the CA getting too big is not one that they would support. So we are much smaller than the local authorities, in both function and anything else. We are pretty much like a borough council, really. So it's important to kind of recognise that dynamic plays out as well.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to come back to other local authority questions, but I'm just aware of other people on the call that might be interested. And Noel's asked an interesting question. Could we hear a bit more about how you work with the anchor institutions, or perhaps how they've been involved in the donut, whether it's major businesses, employers, civil society?
Yeah. So firstly, I would say that this is an approach that really works nicely with community wealth building in general. So obviously in our region, people are substantively thinking about the power of anchor institutions because of pursuing a community wealth building strategy. And I think so Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Sandwell, 3 of our local authorities are actively pursuing this. And I think Birmingham are the furthest ahead. So in a very practical way, we work very directly with the anchor network coordinators for at least 2 of those places. So Birmingham's anchor network coordinator, deeply involved in the East Birmingham inclusive growth work. And so we work with him quite closely, because that is a really good way to get a sense of what that whole network of anchor institutions wants. So the universities, the hospital trusts, the council, to really look at, I mean, it's particularly employment at the moment, because I think East Birmingham has been a really interesting test case on, there are a load of vacancies in some really key areas of public services, which is again something that I'm sure you'll all recognise. But actually, if you look at East Birmingham, people who apply for jobs in the police or in the health service keep failing to get jobs in these key public services that are all about their place. And so what on earth is going on? And so there's been some quite innovative work that the anchor institutions have led on, but that we are generally supportive of bringing into that kind of capital investment frame. So there's a really interesting piece of work called I Can at the moment, which I can personally take no credit for. That is really a NHS trust plus anchor institution network thing, but that is very much being seen as one of the mechanisms of inclusive growth and one of the mechanisms of the donut in practice that are a really practical thing that the anchor institutions can do. And so I'll share the link to I Can along with the presentation as well, because I think it's really interesting to see what they've done there to try and lower barriers to people from East Birmingham becoming part of the NHS. So there's that part of things. So basically trying to be grease to their elbow. So in those places where the anchor institutions are getting organised, going along with the grain of that. So with Sandwell, when I talk about the Inclusive Growth in Practice partnership, really what we are doing there at the moment is joining that anchor institution network along with all the others, and just seeing how we can be helpful as a combined authority to making that anchor network a success. And Sandwell is a very interesting local authority. It is just to the west of Birmingham. It's formed of 6 towns. So again, a bit like the West Midlands, Sandwell is not a real place, but all the 6 towns of Sandwell are very much real places. And that does have implications for how local authorities function and how anchor networks function. So we know that the best thing we can do there is support those anchor institutions into making a success of that network, whatever form that might take in the future. And they're prioritising, again, employment, but also procurement. So they're doing their procurement analysis at the moment. But to make a final point, and this is like stepping outside of the general CLES model now, part of the issue that we have with our anchor institutions is that collaboration isn't always the easiest thing to do, particularly when you work a job that's really busy. You know, you are doing 7 people's jobs. Your substantive post is already really hard. Why would you do extra stuff? So one of the things I think we can do very effectively is create that collaborative space, and wherever possible we try to do that with our anchor institutions. So Birmingham, that's very much been the challenge. Birmingham and even East Birmingham, so that East Birmingham is the size of Derby. You know, it is so easy for Birmingham to silo because it is so big, and so actually creating those spaces where people can work across institution and stay focused on people and place, I genuinely think is one of the most useful things we can do for the anchor institutions, because it is so easy not to work that way.
Okay, thanks. I know we could go diverting off a community wealth building question. Let's resist it, because I think Noel can perhaps pick up on that at another session. Okay, I've got quite a few questions and I'm aware of time. So one from Louise, are you using the donut as a way to scrutinise and check all decisions? Are there any floor targets that you think, right, do we need to, we need to knock that back? It's too unfair, carbon's too high, emissions are not passing our donut.
Yeah, so where we started was in quite a simple place. So our overview and scrutiny committee wanted us to add to all of our board papers, alongside equalities implications, we also now have inclusive growth implications. And again, this is another culture shift thing for the organisation, because this is not like a legal check where you need someone from your legal department to say, oh yes, these are the legal implications of this, you are correct, well done. This is about you having considered the inclusive growth implications in the piece of work you're doing a paper about and being able to reflect those in that paragraph. And I do get quite a lot of colleagues, in the very best of intentions, emailing me to check their inclusive growth implications, which is definitely not the vibe, which is again why we've pursued this inclusive growth business partners model to try and increase the literacy of it. What we didn't do in the first instance is use the donut as Kate Rayworth does to show the overshoot and undershoot. So we started very much with the what implication does this have for vision and strategy and how you prioritize and connect pieces of work. We are now, as you could probably tell from that snippet of that Miro board I showed you, now starting to do the work on what does accountability look like. And we have to be really careful here. And I will emphasize this has not yet been to our thematic board, so I'm not going to say that this is yet a thing. But what we know is that, so take healthy life expectancy. We know as a combined authority, we are not the only game in town there, right? Like we are not even a planning authority. You know, we do not control the welfare benefit system. We do not pull a lot of the levers that dictate those really massive things about how people's lives pan out. However, I do not think, and I don't think our work to date has shown that you can't sideline these issues. You have to show that that's what you're aiming for, even if you know that what you've got to tackle that with is actually not everything you need. So we need to walk a really fine line between keeping that massive issue in sight whilst not turning around to our mayor or to our portfolio holders and going, oh, well, that's your fault, you know, because that is demonstrably not the case. We want to hold ourselves accountable for those things that we absolutely can do better, not, you know, bring people down for things that, you know, we know are not possible in the here and now. So I find that a really tough line to walk, and I'm sure there will be lots of hard arguments about what does and doesn't go in there, but we are starting to do it, because I think one thing I would like to start now is, in the same way that we have internal audits for all other sorts of things that relate to risk, I would like to start auditing internally for inclusive growth and for the donut, because I really do think it lends itself to that. Because actually, it doesn't always have to be a you failed, this isn't good enough. This is just about a, oh God, you were so nearly there if you just worked with that person and brought that person in, you know. And I think the best of internal audit actually does feel like that. It feels like a really deep exposition of how things are done and really helps you to understand how to do them better. And so I do think the donut would be magnificent in internal audit. I appreciate that I might have more enthusiasm for audit than many people do. So we haven't yet started seriously using the donut for accountability, but subject to the agreement of our leadership, that is where I think it would go. So we are now doing the undershoot overshoot calculations for ourselves to kind of work out, all right, well, what are those main tensions? So one really obvious one, if we look at climate change, is that we know that the poorest part of our region are also the lowest carbon. So am I going to say to people in Walsall, oh, I'm sorry, now that you're more prosperous, you can't buy things like people in North Warwickshire can? You know, that does not feel like a vibe. But so there's got to be a way for you to feel prosperous and happy about stuff without you adding to that carbon total. But at the moment, we don't totally have the answer to that. So we have to know that that tension exists. Otherwise, we will not face up to it.
Thanks, Claire. That's a really good answer, really full as well. It sort of linked really to one that Pauline has asked. How have BAME communities been engaged and contributed to the West Midlands inclusive growth? And you just talked about them being adversely impacted by economic, education, housing, health inequalities. And I think for people like me and Noel and others from the London authorities, we do a lot of learning from you on that.
Yeah, so in a number of ways, but also, and this probably goes for the work as a whole, there's always a slight challenge in a combined authority about how you do community involvement, which is one of the reasons we set so much store by how we partner with local authorities, because if it's too strategic, sometimes it's really hard for people to work out what on earth they're doing in that room and why on earth they should bother with things. So when we first did the inclusive growth definition, we made a real effort to work with intermediary groups that work with minoritized and excluded communities. You know, we made sure that the Poverty and Truth Commissions were involved. You know, we went and sat in places in different communities around the West Midlands to see if people wanted to participate in drop-ins about inclusive growth, which I appreciate might seem really silly in the here and now. But yes, you know, we made a real effort to try and make it an inclusive definition. And where we have tried to work, so East Birmingham the targeting of that as a place that we would prioritise is deliberate, because that is one of the most diverse parts of this region. It is one of the poorest parts, but it's also like, it's not just one place. Yes, it is the size of Derby, but it's a Derby that's composed of lots of different communities, both in literal places, but also different community groups. And what we've tried to support Birmingham in doing there is to really fulsomely and deeply engage with those communities and involve them in the substance of this regeneration programme. So I want to keep emphasising that this is not just an us show. This wouldn't be happening if Birmingham's local leadership weren't absolutely committed to working in this way. But it does start to show you the tension between how we've always done things and how inclusive growth and the donut gets you to do it. Because the inclusive growth strategy for East Birmingham is, it's a beautiful document. It looks really, really good, but it is very planning-y. And actually, when you're trying to talk to normal communities, BAME or otherwise, about, this is about your place, what do you think about it? Sometimes it's really hard, where you're like, oh, I mean, it looks fine, but it's really hard to disentangle what it literally means for Bordesley Green, So we have tried quite hard to emphasise that how things are done is as important as what is proposed. And to the greatest extent, if you can get people to be involved in what is proposed and actually shape your master planning and shape your capital investment proposals and shape your public service reorganisation, the better it is. Where I think we will do much better on involving minoritised communities is with the soft research that I mentioned before, because that's the bit that has really been missing the truly inclusive part of the inclusive growth donut. So if we're able to target, and this is our plan, like do community research in places we know people are having the worst economic experience. So, we can look at vaccine uptake rates, I think, as a very good metric for where do people not trust us. Where are people being cared about for the first time when someone wants to jab you in the arm with something. Like that's the places where we really need to have those community research things happening, because I think we'll get the most interesting answers to, is the tension that we think the data says in our donut the real tension that is experienced by people who live in communities. So I'm sorry, that was a very meandering answer. But in short, probably not as much as we should have done, but I think there is some there, and there is more specific things that we've got planned. And I will say also that the social economy work is very conscious of this, and we have tried to, within that work, understand where are minoritized community-led social enterprises having different outcomes to the general social enterprise, and then we've tried to do some intersectional work then that's going to be brought through into the way we design that programme. So it's definitely factored in.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just aware of time, so I'm going to squeeze in two more questions. There's one around metrics and bellwether metrics, and I know you had a slide on that, and you referred to people that you'd used, and some of it was open source. I wonder if you could just quickly reference that again.
So what's the question, sorry, about where the
question, let me just find it. It's around the bellwether metrics that we used.
Yeah. So the way that we've picked those, and I guess there are varying levels of science to it. So I think the reason we picked, for example, children in families with children in temporary accommodation is that if you look at homelessness is like, rough sleeping is the tip of the iceberg with homelessness. Our homelessness problem in the region is families. It is moms and children. That is the homelessness problem we have. So it makes sense to me that if we had really cracked designing out homelessness, that is the figure that would go down. Now, rough sleeping is still massively important. That is a huge exclusion that has happened to those people who are rough sleeping. But we know that actually, and everyone in has been a very good example of this, if you want to do something about rough sleeping, you can. You absolutely can. This is not a lack of beds problem for rough sleeping. It's a lack of will problem. Whereas the challenge for that kind of homelessness is significantly different. So we have tried where possible to have a very good explanation for why that is the bellwether metric. But we are in the process of having arguments about that, you know. So like I will speak to colleagues in Transport for West Midlands who will feel really differently to me about whether an affordability composite is the best bellwether or whether we should do centres you can access within 45 minutes. You know, I'm not going to pretend that it will be perfect and right, and I'm also not going to pretend that there is only one way of doing it. And I try and emphasize this a lot. Like, the point is not to get it like, tick, your inclusive growth framework is correct now. It's is this credibly a bellwether? Like, could I explain to you why I think that tells you lots? And I think that being the case, then that is okay. But yeah, we are still very much in the middle of that.
Okay, thank you for that. This is, I guess, more of a statement really than a question, but some comments around...
It wouldn't be a meeting if there wasn't a statement that isn't a question.
Well, it's just really just to note, really. I guess Kate Raworth talks about thriving, regenerative placemaking, etc., good growth. And I guess I'm thinking that that's what you're thinking when you're using the term inclusive growth. And I'm just trying to see, someone put a note in the comment about, should it be degrowth? Inclusive degrowth.
Well, and I think what we're trying to, so I will say here and now that inclusive degrowth, I do not think would work in the the way our leadership sees it at the moment. But our model of inclusive growth is not just, and this kind of goes back to the beginning of how we form that, what you are growing in inclusive growth is well-connected places and climate resilient places and people who are housed safely. And so actually you care more about growing the consequences of growth. Like, and of course people are still absolutely focused on traditional growth. Like, I will not stand in front of you and say that that's not a thing. It is absolutely a thing. But inclusive growth encourages you, as Kate Raworth does. She says very clearly she's not anti-growth, she's growth agnostic, because actually it's about, well, what is that growth literally doing? Is it creating thriving people? Is it being regenerative of the environment? And provided that that is the case, then, you know, crack on. And so that's what we've tried to do, really. It's to articulate those outcomes of economic activity that we feel are resonant with the donut. And I think in a multi-party combined authority, I don't think that anyone has substantively disagreed with any of those outcomes as things that we want to achieve together. And I think that's quite a heartening thing.
Well, that in itself is achievement. And I think we saw it really clearly on the slide that you had showing the 5-year plan for up to 2041 for the jobs, skills and training. So you've already mapping out, especially in an area where you've got manufacturing issues, that you're already starting to plan out where are the jobs that are going to be vulnerable and how do we start adapting now.
And I'm sure we're not alone in doing that, but yeah, that is, as you say, a massively important thing.
Right, really aware of time, so quick question, would you be willing to share, I mean, we've got your slides and there's quite a lot there that you've put in terms of your assessment framework, but quite a few people saying, are you up for sharing in terms of the donut model that you've used?
Like anything I can share, I will share. I'll try and pull together on WeTransfer or the like, a little bundle of useful stuff. And yeah, we're always really happy to share what we've done, because like I take so much heart from, you know, in the presentation you described when Cornwall showed us how they'd embedded the donut into their decision-making process. It shows you it can be done. You're like, great, if it can happen in Cornwall, it can happen here. And so that's the thing that I think these meetings give us the most chance to do, which is to feel confident that things we want to be possible are. So yeah, we'll definitely do all the sharing and linking up for sure.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. Noel's going to send round the recording and the slides, and Claire's slides, so we can add whatever she can share with us for that. It's exactly 1:30, so I wanted to say a huge thanks to Claire. Thank you for putting it together. Thank you so much for all your questions. I'm sorry if I had to rush some of them through, but I think we've packed as much as we possibly could on the donut into 60 minutes. So thank you so much, everybody, and big thanks to Claire. Thank you.
Thank you all. Lovely to